The global high-control society that supports capitalist realism mechanically operates by disrupting the formation of an individual's subjectivity, which allows the cultural atmosphere of capitalist realism to subliminally implant the concept of productivity into our unconscious minds, addicting us to the control that is exerted over us. Then, capitalists lend us money in the hopes that we're unable to pay it off, meaning we must continue to earn money and pay off our tab. From there, like Remy under our chef's hat, capitalism can control us without having to use any force at all. Fisher sums it up like this: if the figure of previous high-control societies was the worker-prisoner, the figure of the new form of control is the debtor-addict. Hello and welcome to Simply Radical, your personal ticket to understandable radical left-wing theory. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick around for a bit. Most of my videos here are summaries of books written by authors better informed than me, from an MLM perspective. Sometimes I also make videos about specific ideas or events. If you've got a suggestion for me, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for y'all's feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and if you're a freak, you can even click the bell icon for notifications. Alright, without further ado, let's get this shit show on the road. The disruption of people's subjectivity also serves to undermine traditional literacy. While the vast majority of people are technically literate in that they can recognize and use writing, they are also by and large both incapable of and unwilling to sit down to engage with and wrestle with a long, difficult text. That's actually why I made this channel in the first place. This isn't an individual moral failing, but a result of the way that our capitalist society operates. Data is now mostly conveyed through voices and images, and any text we encounter rarely, if ever, exceeds the length of an ad read. As you might expect, this is of particular concern to educators, who are now required to be entertainers because their students, thanks to the disruption of their subjectivity, must constantly be entertained in order to sustain any kind of attention. Teachers are also simultaneously required to serve as state-appointed mommies in accordance with the old type of high-control society of the school. Obviously, these are mutually exclusive. Discipline doesn't work the way it used to because it relies on the constraining of a student's subjectivity, which no longer exists. At the same time, teachers cannot be entertainers because they're put in a position of authority, which makes them inherently boring. On top of that, teachers are also increasingly taking on the role of a third parent, as families now require both parents to work, meaning children are left to their own devices for large periods of time, and therefore not socialized correctly. If nobody is around to tell you as a child that it's socially inappropriate to pull someone's pants off in public, you'll probably end up doing it at school, more out of naivete than malice, thereby making it your teacher's problem that you weren't taught better. The headaches for teachers don't end even in college, where students theoretically don't have to be there. But with minimal work opportunities available to the non-college educated, and self-serving but highly profitable encouragement, read propaganda, from governments and schools, college seems like a safe bet. As Fisher observes, it actually is among the most effective strategies that capitalist realism uses to control us. It enables both the constant education and upskilling of the control addict, while also being expensive beyond comprehension, and therefore requiring the taking out of debt, at least in the US. Therefore, university students are controlled by both addiction and debt. And for what, quote, so you can get the same Mick job you would have worked if you'd left school at age 16, asks Fisher, noted university professor. So the question remains, if we live in a terrible, all-consuming capitalist dystopia that is so immune to resistance that the act of resistance in and of itself is incorporated into the system as a pillar of support, what is to be done? Well, now is where Fisher starts to pivot towards that question. And in his typical fashion, he starts by depressingly critiquing the solutions that many contemporaries proposed. You see, the Overton window, or the spectrum of mainstream political thought, as it was in 2009 when the book was written, spanned from the disruptive French unions of the left to the charitable tech billionaires of Silicon Valley on the right. The French unions at the time were particularly relevant as they just undertook a program of anti-austerity strikes and protests, but Fisher observed that, while they are effective in terms of resisting the expansion of capitalism into other sectors of French society, the unions themselves have material incentives to keep capitalism as a system in place. That might seem a little counterintuitive, but think about it for a second. The union's power comes from its position within capitalism, its ability to marshal the working class against the ruling class. If the system were remade in such a way that the working class was now in control, the union by definition would have no more reason to exist, and thus no more power. So, Union leadership is incentivized to thread the needle, keeping capitalist structures in place so as to have something to fight, while also pushing back against the expansion of those structures so as to have a reason to fight. That, unfortunately, is not an organization that is materially incentivized to move beyond capitalism to a radical reorganization of society. It is little more than temporary immobilization, a small speed bump for the ruling class driven in large part by a dejected, demotivated disengagement with the system. On the right, meanwhile, the Silicon Valley tech billionaire ideology has become dominant, thanks to some fantastic marketing that branded it as progressive, something that would solve the problems of capitalism through technological innovation. This, of course, is realized through deregulation, among other things, allowing the quote-unquote free market to find a solution. The really sinister part of this ideology is that the fuel in the believers that makes it go is really actually the problems caused by capitalism in the first place. The impending climate collapse, for instance, motivates us to foist ever-increasing power into the hands of electric car manufacturers in an effort to quote-unquote solve the problem. When compared to this, anything that the actual left might propose seems inherently regressive. Why would we quote-unquote go backwards by regulating Elrond Musk or Jim Bonzo's tech companies? They're pioneering the future of our society. The Silicon Valley ideology also successfully branded itself as decentralized, flexible, nomadic, and spontaneous, thereby implicitly framing the left, who obviously oppose its free market rhetoric, as stuffy, boring, and wrong. That's not the end of it, though. In an effort to get out ahead of the criticisms of for-profit companies making money from these ventures, the Silicon Valley ideology includes a laundromat of charities and nonprofits that thrive on donations from tech oligarchs, not actually solving any issues, but making their benefactors seem benevolent and kind. Of course, this societal shift came from a well-organized, well-funded, and well-marketed propaganda push from the likes of Stephen Careers and Bill Gates in the 80s and 90s. And in order for the left to claw back space on the Overton window, a similar process must take place coming from the left. Fisher argues that the onset of neoliberalism and the installation of capitalist realism was in essence a wholesale restoration of capitalist class power, which had been weakened in the wake of World War II. He mirrors the sentiment of another scholar on the matter, observing that, quote, "In an era popularly described as post-political, the class war has continued to be fought, but only by one side, the wealthy." Indeed, the propaganda push I mentioned just a few minutes ago seems to be a through line with the pre-war class struggle, a lesson learned by the capitalists from the Leninists of the USSR. Just as the Soviets used think tanks to create an ideologically informed intellectual vanguard to helm their socialist project, the neoliberals did the same, creating organizations like the much-publicized Heritage Foundation in the 80s to help feed far-right ideology and talking points to the politicians that they bought allegiance from. They went one step further, though, creating cultural organizations like every online leftist's favorite punching bag, PragerU, to feed those far-right talking points into the cultural atmosphere itself, helping contribute to the formation of the capitalist realism we find ourselves in today. Such sophisticated cultural and ideological tools allowed the issues with capitalism that everyone experiences to be used as fuel for two new capitalist ideologies, depending on an individual's emotional reaction to these issues. If you are predisposed to feel dejected and disengaged, you'll end up on the back foot in the unions, fighting merely against the expansion of a system that you've tacitly acknowledged cannot be dismantled. The immobilizers, as Fisher calls them. Or, if such a slate of problems motivates you to get things done to solve them, you'll end up pushed towards the Silicon Valley ideology, where technology is the messianic solution to every problem, and the only thing standing in the way of that is anything that inhibits the functioning of Fortune 500 tech conglomerates. Don't worry about the side effects. Some of that money is going into the hands of the tech CEO, will end up in a non-profit organization or a charity, so clearly whatever problems they do cause will be taken care of. And finally, Fisher makes a recommendation as to where to go from here. What must be discovered is a way out of the motivation/demotivation binary, so that disidentification from the control program registers as something other than dejected apathy. One strategy would be to shift the political terrain, to move away from the union's traditional focus on pay and onto forms of discontent specific to neoliberalism. Simple as. Let me break that down a bit for you. Basically, to build a viable challenge to the strength of capitalism and capitalist realism, the left needs to break into the common people's Overton window, disrupting the binary between the immobilizers and the Silicon Valley ideology, and provide a new political home where the problems with capitalism aren't repurposed to support capitalism, but to push for the destruction of capitalism. To do this, Fisher suggests focusing on problems in capitalism other than pay. Difficult to say specifically what he had in mind here, but perhaps it included the concept of tenant unions, who don't have the same ideological baggage as traditional unions and operate from a different angle within capitalism. So we've talked a lot about how capitalism and its corresponding cultural atmosphere, capitalist realism, has changed since the 1980s 1980s and the introduction of the ideology of neoliberalism. One of Fisher's favorite ways to illustrate these changes is by looking at the difference between gangster movies produced before and after that cultural shift. Before, the gangster movies focused on mafia families, hierarchical organizations with deep cultural ties to the old country where they originated, like The Godfather. Today, gangster movies tend to center unrooted crews of diverse participants coming together for one or a few big jobs. Think about The Heat. Gangsters in today's movies aren't a part of an intricate hierarchical organization with its own cultural customs like the Casa Nostra of The Godfather. They're groups of professional criminals with little to no association among themselves. Often these co-workers, if you will, don't even know each other's real names. In a word, gangs in today's movies have been gigified, the same way that taxi driving was turned into Uber and Lyft. In a gig economy, workers are no longer able to specialize in one specific skill to sustain them throughout their working lives, but are periodically forced to reskill according to the demands of the labor market. This results in the rearranging of organizations along more decentralized lines, swapping the pyramidal shape of a company, union, or mafia for one shaped more like a web, where each node is its own self-contained unit that can be swapped out at any time. Marketers would refer to this kind of work as more flexible. In reality, that means precarious. In such a work environment, different qualities are incentivized. Under the old system, organizations incentivized a more familial set of values like obligation, trustworthiness, and commitment. But now, those are tossed out the window in favor of the values incentivized by the free market. Mercenary self-interest, lack of commitment, and above all, flexibility, read precarity, are now the selling points that employers look for. And this has ripple effects over the culture as a whole. This simple change to the structure of work under capitalism isolates workers from larger networks of friends and family, both in their companies and outside. Why bother becoming friends with your coworkers if you're probably going to lose your job next year? Not only that, but it increasingly splits these networks in pursuit of money. As soon as we leave school, we all go our separate ways, moving to different cities, states, countries, or continents, all in pursuit of a good job. That leaves only our immediate family, our spouse, and potentially children to pick up the social slack of an entire community that was shattered by capitalism. Fisher puts it like this: the situation of the family in new capitalism is contradictory, in precisely the way that traditional Marxism expected. Capitalism requires the family, as an essential means of reproducing and caring for labor power, as a salve for the wounds inflicted by chaotic social economic conditions, even as it undermines it, denying parents time with children, putting intolerable stress on couples as they become the exclusive source of affective consolation for each other. This change was much more abrupt than you might have expected, too. Citing the text, according to Marxist economist Christian Marazzi, the switch from the old system to the new system can be given a very specific date, October 6th, 1979. It was on that date that the Federal Reserve increased interest rates by 20 points, preparing the way for the supply-side economics that would constitute the economic reality in which we are now enmeshed. The rise in interest rates not only contained inflation, it made possible a new organization of the means of production and distribution. The rigidity of the old production line gave way to a new flexibility, a word that will send chills of recognition down the spine of every worker today. This flexibility was defined by a deregulation of capital and labor, with the workforce being employed on a temporary basis and outsourced. These new changes were spurred on, shaped, and reinforced by the increasing adoption of information technology and automation into the workplace. Thanks to the internet, emailing, video conferencing, and the digitization of records made it possible for workers to work completely isolated from the office, being productive while even on a different continent from their employer. I'm sure you can think of thousands of other downline effects that this may have had as well. It wasn't entirely bad though. The change also somewhat blurred delineations between parts of the working class that have been solid before. Prior to all of this, workers were strictly divided between blue and white collar positions, where blue collar workers were largely not allowed to talk amongst themselves while on the job because it was seen as a waste of time by their employers. Now, though, as any Amazon employee can tell you, the productive process is so completely enmeshed with communication that it would be literally impossible to accomplish the job without communication, whether it be in the form of the internet, phone, or email. Of course, this has always to some extent been the case with white-collar workers, but it has also grown in size and scope. This has a flip side though, because work is constantly communicating nowadays. That means it's constantly in communication with you. Work and life become inseparable, at least while you're employed. There aren't work hours and free time anymore. There's only periods of employment and periods of unemployment. This change in our relationship to work, the most time-consuming thing any of us do in our respective lives, also changes the way that we perceive time. If that's not trippy enough though, it also fundamentally changes the way that we perceive class too. Under the old system, the divisions between time and class, as rigid as they were, made everyone really instinctually feel what it meant to be a worker, or what it meant to be an owner. You knew where you sat in the class structure, because you saw the limits of it every day. That sucked. And so the resentment of the class barriers allowed the new system system to be sold to us as a revolutionary change, one that will tear down the barriers of class and allow all of us to sink or swim according to our own merit. Believe it or not, though, that's not what it did. The new system took those class barriers, antagonism is the crusty term, and forced us to internalize them. Now, class antagonisms aren't real-world barriers imposed on us by an outside force. They're literally inside of us, like the angel and the devil on our shoulders. How did that happen, though? That's insane. Well, the new system accomplished this, like it did with our relationship to time, by changing the economic incentives that we live all of our lives by. Before, working class people got a job, and then money came in and they spent it on shit. Simple. But now, there's all these complicated financial tools that are so often imposed on us, even without our knowledge, much less permission. For example, has a workplace of yours ever set you up with a pension fund, a 401k, or some other kind of retirement account? Do you know how those work? Very briefly, these tools work by having a worker contribute money into an account every paycheck, sometimes matched by the employer. That money is then gambled on the stock market, and whatever it makes is put back into the account as profit. Now, not only do you have to be employed to pay for your life right now, but in order to have any semblance of a hope of retiring at some point, you need to play the stock market game. You need to try and make as much money as you can by investing that money and selling the stocks or bonds you invested in for a profit. You need to act like a business owner, minimizing costs and maximizing profits. You are operating in real life with the economic incentives of a worker, and in your retirement account with the economic incentives of a capitalist, angel, and devil. Fisher speculates that being forced to live your life on both sides of the class war from day one is probably not great for your mental health. He thought it probably played a role in the increasing prevalence of mental illness, particularly bipolar disorder. Why specifically BPD? Well, when you think about it, capitalism as a system kind of inherently engages in bipolar behavior, with manic highs and depressive lows being encouraged at various times throughout the market's boom and bust cycles. Oliver James's research seems to corroborate that theory, and also narrows the focus specifically onto the new form of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. As it does with everything, though, the cultural atmosphere of capitalist realism doesn't acknowledge this systemic cause of mental illness, but individualizes and medicalizes it, framing it as an individual problem that comes from chemical imbalance or lifestyle choices. And to be clear, both your individual brain chemistry and lifestyle choices of course do have an impact on your mental health, but the claim Fisher is making here is that it's probably more effective from a global scale to look at how the most time-consuming part of everyone's lives have drastically changed in the last few decades, specifically when research shows that these elevated levels of mental illness arose in conjunction with those changes. Capitalist realism's dismissive and frankly callous treatment of mental health is the result of several economic incentives. First, by individualizing the problem, it allows attention to be directed away from the system and onto the individual sufferer. This is a common trend in all kinds of capitalism, but it's especially insidious here. In conjunction with the massive rise of mental illness, a new incredibly lucrative market emerged that relies on treating and medicating people for illnesses caused by much greater systemic issues. SSRIs, therapists, therapy platforms, and so on and so forth, they're all for-profit actors, doing their best to maximize the number of people that pay them money for their product or service, the profit incentive. And just like the profit incentive in non-mental health care leads to consistently lower outcomes, overprescription, overmedication, addiction, worsening working conditions, and so on and so forth, it also systematically destroys mental health care for the sake of profit. Repoliticizing the concept of mental health, both in the opinion of Mark Fisher and my own, is essential to combating the pervasiveness of capitalist realism. Unfortunately, though, this is far from the only negative mental impact that neoliberal capitalism has on our minds. As exemplified in the 1999 film Office Space, great movie if you haven't seen it, neoliberal workplaces often impose themselves onto their workers' creativity and self-expression itself. In the film, it is mandatory for workers at a restaurant to put at least 7 pieces of personal flair on their uniform. This is as clear as an example as it gets of one's self-expression being incorporated into the work being performed itself, and as many of you I'm sure can attest, isn't very far beyond the realm of reality. It goes beyond that though. As one of the characters soon finds out, neoliberal capitalism also includes unofficial standards that, while not explicitly stated, are indeed enforced. 7 pieces of flair are all that's required, but quote, you don't want to look like the sort of person that only does the bare minimum. Infuriatingly reflective of real life, at least in my opinion. In the beginning, the spread of this kind of wasteful bureaucracy might seem to be ironic, given the fact that neoliberalism in the beginning was marketed as a way to slash red tape and get rid of bureaucracy. But it really should be entirely expected given the internal structure of neoliberalism as an ideology. Because neoliberalism destroyed the pyramidal hierarchical organization of workplaces that was left over from the old system, there were no middle managers or bureaucrats to gather, organize, and convey needed information about a company's workforce to the powers that be. When the middle managers were removed, the need for understanding the productivity of workers at a company didn't, so it needed to create a replacement. This manifested in two equally terrible forms. First, constant surveillance. Second, shifting that bureaucracy down onto the plates of the workers themselves. The first is rather self-explanatory, though we'll touch more on it in a bit. The bureaucracy, however, might seem initially confusing because we tend to associate it with workers being hired to do pointless report compiling that nobody cares about. But in the new system, instead of hiring someone else to do that, owners simply force the workers themselves to do it. Just think of how many self-guided performance assessments you've had to do, how much personal goal setting you've had to do at work, how many documents you've had to create and send off to corporate only to literally never hear about it again unless something was wrong. There's the bureaucracy that neoliberalism supposedly eliminated. In situations where this logic is applied to operations that are not easily marketized, like schools, healthcare, and so on, this begins an inflationary spiral of bureaucracy that continually adds more and more paperwork to the plates of workers at those institutions for no discernible benefit. Teachers spend far more time writing lesson plans, being observed, attending meetings, performing self-evaluations, setting targets, assessing why those targets have or have not been met, setting further goals, etc., than they do actually teaching. And if you've ever spoken to a teacher, you know that literally none of this paperwork ever even vaguely helps teacher or student. The majority of it gets sent off to admin only to be literally never heard about unless something was wrong. Neoliberal bureaucracy then doesn't actually reflect the work at hand, but rather an idealized and abstracted representation of the work. This creates a paradigm where the task at hand for workers isn't to actually do the job, but rather to generate and curate the most ideal representation of doing the job. In English, by forcing teachers to spend the majority of their time doing paperwork that actually isn't connected to their teaching, it changes their incentive from being the best teacher possible to being the best person to do paperwork vaguely related to teaching possible. This was ironically exactly the same problem that Stalin's Soviet Union had. Middle managers in the USSR were incentivized not to improve the quality of the work they oversaw, so much as improve how it sounded when they told Stalin in the Central Committee about it. Thanks to this, Fisher likes to refer to neoliberalism, somewhat cheekily, as market Stalinism. Because this trend of separating the quality of work from the quality of the perception of work is observable right across the entire economy, it also separates investment, the stock market, from the actual quality of work, and instead ties it to the perception of work. Companies don't attract investors because they're actually doing good things, but because they look like they're doing good things. Fisher sums it up. In capitalism, that is to say, all that is solid melts into PR, and late capitalism is defined at least as much by this ubiquitous tendency towards PR production as it is by the imposition of market mechanisms. This divorce between reality and our perception creates a kind of dual perception of reality in society at large. On one hand is the perception of capitalist companies as responsible and caring, and on the other hand, in reality, everyone actually knows that companies are ruthless, corrupt, and evil. We cope with this cognitive dissonance, as the Krusty would say, by incorporating discussions about the shittiness of companies into our art. The artists producing it would probably say this is more an effort to criticize these companies and draw attention to their wrongdoing, and it does occasionally work like that. Most of the time, though, what happens is that the people that engage with that art emerge with a naive sense of superiority. We tell ourselves that there were others, maybe even just people in previous generations, who took that art at face value, without picking up on the subtext. For perhaps the cringiest of examples, think about the Marvel franchise. Many of those movies have anti-war, anti-colonial, or even anti-capitalist subtextual themes, but instead of actually meaningfully engaging with the plot or culminating in anything, they just sit in the background until the movie is over. This kind of disregard or even outright dismissal of symbolic meaning reinforces the detachment between reality and our perception, because it encourages us to actively look away from the economic and political structures in which our art was made, or in short, it discourages critical thought. Why would we think about the anti-colonial themes of Black Panther being waved away at the last minute, and how that could potentially be due to the fact that it was produced by an actively colonial society if that subtext isn't important, just by virtue of it being subtext? The quote-unquote good guy won, no more thought necessary. Outside of our art, it goes the other way too. Even if we know for a fact that reality directly contradicts our perception, we cannot help but comply with our perception, because to acknowledge it as wrong would shatter the whole illusion. Fisher illustrated that concept with one of Zizek's examples about a judge. Quote, "I know very well that things are the way I see them, that this judge is a corrupted weakling, but I nonetheless treat him respectfully, since he wears the insignia of a judge, so that when he speaks, it is the law itself which speaks through him." Reality TV takes this one step further by incorporating the viewer into the art itself. Not the viewer as they are, mind you, but a twisted, abstracted representation of the viewer. The viewer. TM. In reality TV, a core part of the entertainment is the fact that the actors know that they're being watched, but they don't know who is watching them, or maybe even what country the show will be broadcast in. The viewer, TM, that actors on set interact with isn't the actual person on their couch, but, say it with me now, an abstract representation of the person. Because the actor on the show that the person is watching isn't actually themselves, but rather an abstract representation of themselves. Fisher refers to this feedback loop of reciprocal abstraction as a control circuit, and observes that they are present throughout neoliberal capitalism. If you're new to this, let me know how I did. Does this make any sense at all, or are you more confused than you were before? If you're old to this, let me know what you think I missed, and leave your reading recommendations in the comments. If you've somehow made it to the end of this monster video, and would like to see more communist content, please negate the algorithm's distaste for progressive revolutionary content by liking and subscribing, and maybe tossing a link or two to a bud, preach. Lastly, but most importantly, the views expressed in this video are solely those of the book's author, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the video creator. It has been made solely for educational and entertainment purposes, and the creator does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy, applicability, fitness, or completeness of the content within. Please don't hurt me.